I'm Jocelyn Olcott. I'm a professor of history and international and comparative studies, and currently serve as the director of the program in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies here at Duke University. Before I turn things over to Rika Pratis to introduce Eileen Boris, I just want to say how thrilled we are to have Eileen here, if only for a virtual visit. We had invited her to deliver the Anne Fire Scott lecture last March, which is our sort of prestigious lecture in women's and gender history, but it was of course canceled along with the rest of life last spring when the pandemic hit. This event forms part of an ongoing international interdisciplinary collaboration on revaluing care in the global economy. I'm thrilled to see that several members of the research network are actually attending this lecture. We launched this a couple of years ago, and we have focused on three principal research areas. The first is metrics, so how we measure care and how it affects care when we try to measure it. The second is governance, so how laws and policies both foster and reflect normative values of care. And the third is social practices, how various practices and social formations inform attention to care. We have also started from two fundamental premises that have become even more evident in the current pandemic. First, that social, cultural, and ecological care are all interdependent and imbricate. And second, that innovative solutions to the so-called crisis of care can be found in many corners of the world, particularly those that have been most suspicious of market and technology-based solutions. If you're interested in learning more about the research network and our projects, please put your email address in the chat box. We are planning a diverse schedule of programming centered on how to foster an economy in the service of care and sustainability rather than in the service of efficiency and growth. We have events coming up on decolonizing well-being governance and on universal basic income, as well as follow-up events on from an earlier workshops on vaccination and on mutual aid organizations. The Revaluing Care in the Global Economy project has enjoyed broad support at Duke, particularly from the Office of Global Affairs. And for this lecture, we especially want to thank the Mellon-funded Humanities Unbounded program, including Jamal Quick, who's been incredibly helpful with the logistics for this event, and the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. On one technical point, I assume you're all familiar with Zoom etiquette by now, but before I turn things over to Rika, we do ask that everybody mute their microphones for now so that we can hear the speaker. Feel free to use the raise hand and chat features to ask a question, and we'll monitor those. And Rika will be kind of running the Q&A session at the end. And please be aware that we're recording today's session. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, please just turn off your video. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Rika Pratis to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jolie. Thank you very much, Eileen, for being here today. Before we start, I would like to actually start by acknowledging that those of us who are meeting in and around Durham today are gathering on the traditional lands of the Ino, Okanichi, and Saponi people, the traditional owners of this land, and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that welcome to all Indigenous people that might be here with us today in the audience. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Eileen Boris, who's the Hull Professor and Distinguished Professor of Feminist Studies, History, Black Studies, and Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her latest book is Making the Woman Worker, Precarious Labor and the Fight for Global Standards, 1919 to 2019, that came out with Oxford University Press last year, and the co-edited collection with Sandra Dawson and Barbara Maloney, Engendering Transnational Transgressions from the Intimate to the Global, that is coming out next year. Other works include the prize-winning monographs Home to Work, Motherhood and the Politics of Industrial Homework in the United States with Cambridge University Press, and Caring for America, Home Health Workers in the Shadows of the Welfare State, co-authored with Jennifer Klein with Oxford Press. She's also the co-editor with Racel Salazar Pereñas of Intimate Labors, Cultures, Technologies, and the Politics of Care, and with Dorothy Hertka and Susan Zimmerman, Women's ILO, Transnational Networks, Global Labor Standards, and Gender Equity. Professor Boris' public writings have appeared in the New York Times, the American Prospect, Time, The Nation, Al Jazeera America, Huffington Post, New Labor Forum, Dissident, and Labor Notes. The president of the International Federation for Research in Women's History from 2015 to 2020. She has held the Bicentennial Chair in American Studies, University of Helsinki, and visiting professorships at Paris 7, the University of Melbourne, Tokyo Christian Women's University, and the University of Toulouse. Professor Boris has been the PI on many research projects, among them working at Living, the Social Relations of Precarity, the Enforcement strategies for employment, models for the California Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, and the project Labor of Care. She's part of the research network on domestic work. Her current project is Stranded No More, Migrant Domestic Workers Seeking Justice, which is a history of less than free labor, the employment broker, Black and Puerto Rican migration, immigration, and the regulation of domestic work, and those who fought back in the US and globally. And a spin-off project that's entitled Like One of the Family, Sex, Enslavement, and Justice Delayed, which is a microhistory of the 1947 13th Amendment case, US versus Ingle. So I would like to say, join me in welcoming, but we unfortunately only have these very sad little buttons for applaud, but still join me in welcoming Professor Eileen Boris.
Well, thank you. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, even virtually. But of course, if I had come on the old way till we get new forms of
I think I got a lot of books.
traveling through space and time, I will. Yeah, can you hear me? I used to get up at 4:30 in the morning to get to the East Coast, so maybe getting up at 6:30 is a little easier. In any case, I'm delighted to be here. Delighted to be with Josie Olcott and to meet Rakika. And thank you, Jamal, for all your behind the scenes work, for this crabby professor who is getting used to this world of remote. And for all of you who have decided to spend an hour and 15 minutes or whatever, hour and 45 minutes with us today. I'm going to share my screen and go right into this, except I too want to acknowledge the land that I'm on, which is that of the Chumash people, which is where Santa Barbara and UCSB is. Okay. Going to share screen and begin slideshow. Okay, whoops, let's go back one. All right. So I'm going to talk from my recent book that came out just about a year ago, Making the Woman Worker. And for those of us who seek to organize care and other forms of household work, we must confront historic legacies, not only the exceptional place of the home in representation and ideology, but the association of household labor with slavery and segregation, at least in the US context, and the legal structures forged during the 20th century within a male breadwinner regime and a Fordist mode of industrial organization. Home labors appear as not really work, since anyone can do them and should out of love or obligation. Thus, when paid, they really aren't worth much, since there's no shortage of workers. The devaluation of care work has persisted amid the commodification and the privatization of the intimate, accompanying neoliberal market fundamentalism, with care associated with affect, the ties that bind, with the characteristics of the labor subsumed into the identities of the workforce, predominantly female, Black, and immigrant in the United States. Care long has stood apart from work or employment, jobs covered by the labor law. Struggles during the last decades have generated a paradox. The affect deployed in public debates to win legal inclusion circulates emotions that stick to care. The practice of love that is justified classifying care as something different than work. We have conducted these struggles in this country in a globalizing environment in which time and space appear compressed. Capital and labor seem transnational, and so too are social movements. In this context, I turn to the making of the woman worker under global labor standards. Here's the cover of my book. I begin from this premise. The past of feminized labor, part-time, temporary, low wage, uncovered by labor standards or collective bargaining, opens a window into today's precarious world of work. But this regime built on the concept of the woman worker as different from the male worker, and women in the global South as differences other. But this regime was never complete or unchallenged. There were makers in the making of the woman worker, and to the definition of the home as outside of work. Global labor standards were one realm where definitions of what is work and who is a worker became forged to reflect and reinforce power relations between nations, regions, genders, race, ethnicities, classes, castes. Nowhere is this more apparent in the operations of the International Labor Organization, or the ILO. I could actually see, can I go back to, so here's an image of the ILO that was reconstituted by the campaign, the International Campaign of Domestic Workers, taking what would be the ILO symbol and putting a woman worker image in there. I find the ILO, which I'll refer to throughout the talk, an organization good to think with, to explore the topic of women workers organizing for labor standards. So before I proceed this morning, let me provide what I call ILO 101, because the Geneva-based specialized agency attached first to the United Nations, the League of Nations, and then the United Nations, is not well known in the US, which has played a complicated role in its history, but that's for another talk. It founded in the aftermath of World War I by social democrats from Britain and France, but colonial victors, as an alternative to Bolshevism. The ILO has addressed the world of work as a norm-setting body. Through a unique tripartite structure, that is, it represents states, organized workers, and employer associations, it has brought together delegates to pass treaty-like conventions, which are aspirational counterweights to the vicissitudes of the market. The ILO's basic components, the International Labor Office, which I'll refer to as the office, under an elected director general, the governing body, and the annual International Labor Conference, the ILC, have remained, even if branches within the office have varied over the last century. These branches, a global bureaucracy of researchers and civil servants, has generated knowledge about working conditions, legal regimes, social provision, and economic conditions, creating the very statistics and facts available to policymakers and scholars alike. They have characterized the woman worker rather than offering a space for laboring women to define themselves, although in the last decades, some within have set about to do just that, provide an arena for informal, domestic, and low-wage women to demand recognition and rights. The structure of the ILO then, for most of its history, has been almost impenetrable for NGOs and for actually real working people themselves. It's been those peak labor organizations, in this country would be the AFL-CIO, which gets to, with the governments, to decide who gets to go to Geneva for these conferences to make decisions and sit on the various committees. And that's important to understand, because for me, the ILO is very much more about the constructions of discourse and aspirational standards, which come out of a process in which the most progressive measures are often blocked by the employers, particularly in the last 50 years. Okay, I'm going to go back now to my historical narrative. Labor feminists, that is, women in unions and their governments and NGO allies, did at the very beginning shape initial labor standards impacting the woman worker. Indispensable to all working women and to mothers in the home. That was how the French organizer of garment workers, Jean Beauvoir, here she is, characterized a proposal for an 8-hour day, 48-hour week, which a century ago became Convention 1 of the newly formed ILO. In differentiating mother in the home from all working women, she reinforced the separating of mother work from the world of employment that has haunted the formation of global labor standards since. This binary, what some theorists refer to productive and reproductive labor, others to paid and unpaid work, and the ILO as work and family responsibilities, cordon off care from employment. Until the 2000s, paid care work mostly stood outside of ILO deliberations, while unpaid family care became a concern as a means to enhance labor force participation and thus reinforce the valuing of care as a special kind of activity. That is, one performed out of love or duty. With the assumption that any woman could perform it, and the prevalence of those from despised or other groups undertaking its particularly dirty and physical aspects, the labor of care has become cheap, even when paid, rather than embraced or forced. And then, of course, it has assumed that this work would be feminized in the sense that performed by those considered women and was part of the heteronormative femininity. And this is something that, of course, as a researcher, and I look at these historical documents and they're all male or female, and there's no problematizing of gender within the ILO and its production of knowledge until very, very recently. And here is women delegates to the first International Congress of Working Women, which came to Washington, D.C. at the same time as the very first International Labor Conference. And some of these women, like Jean Beauvoir, here's Margaret Dreyer Robbins of the Women's Trade Union League in the U.S., and some of these women were advisors to the delegations, the government delegations and the labor delegations at this very first conference. Now, Beauvoir, as I just said, attended the Washington International Labor Conference as a worker advisor to her country's delegation to France. She was among a handful of women who, as members of the Commission on Employment of Women, developed maternity, which is the third convention, and night work, the fourth convention, against oppositions of male employers, employer representatives. Can you see the full screen, or does my windows on the side of view interfere with that? Can you?
I think we can see the full screen.
Okay, good. All right, because it's a little blocked from me. Okay. These women were present because of the ILO's constitution suggested that countries have women representatives when questions involving women workers were under discussion. An essentialist understanding of gender and sex that is pervaded at the time reform communities no less than the general public. That is, women delegates would somehow be able to represent all women. These champions of women in industry wish to extend protections to other occupations, but they lost out in the deliberations. And I take their understanding of the problem of the woman worker from Mary MacArthur, who was one of the British worker advisors. And she said at the first Congress, and I going to begin my book with this, when the man comes home at night, his day's work is done. He can sit down by the fire and read his newspaper or dig in the garden if he wishes to, but a woman's work is never done. And when she leaves the factory, so it's industrial workers, she usually goes home to begin a new day's work at home. And this understanding, so women needed maternity leave and they needed restrictions on night work. This was the rationale, because they were being overworked. And it was done in a world in which most women workers, even in industrial work, were not organized. Margaret Bonfield was another a British advisor, and she becomes the first woman elected to Parliament. And she becomes later on an appointed delegate to the ILO, and she was supporting these things, but she was also making a distinguish between colonized areas and like in India, she would say, well, she was concerned with children, but it should only be factories and those areas of the economy that are most similar to the Western economy. So you see the kind of colonialist mentality, even among the most labor-oriented and progressive women from a country like Britain. So the dominant perspective in women's labor history has decried women-specific labor standards as inhibiting equal employment. Such arguments echoed the legal equality feminists of the times, who claimed that only equal treatment would do. Special treatment, by definition, led to inequality. Some feminist opponents of women-specific standards, that is minimum wage just for women, restrictions on working hours just for women, and even maternity leave at that time, such as Alice Paul of the National Women's Party and the World's Women's Party later abroad, self-referentially argued that Native women, and by which they meant women in Africa and Asia and colonialized area, should have a right to contract into bonded labor. Otherwise, all women would face workplace discrimination. Others in the British-led Open Door Society offered a promising alternative, setting restraints, that is standards, on the basis of the nature of the work from men as well as women. This image here is of that first International Conference of Working Women called by the National Women's Trade Union League in America that began right before the ILC and then the ILC took over because about 10 or so of the women were also these advisors, but no women initially were delegates who could vote. And Dorothy Sukabel has written a very good essay in our Women's ILO about that moment. Other scholars have written about it as well. Okay. The problem with the proposition of the Open Door Society came from the persistence of occupational segregation. Most ILO standards were gender neutral, with gendered and racialized impacts. Labor standards set parameters to exploitation associated with employment. Some standards, I have argued, really addressed what I call cultures of protection. That is, they dealt with morality, sexuality, the civilizing mission. So when you read about night work standards, the concerns are women becoming ladies of the night, being a woman walking back, she may be sexually assaulted. The concerns are with keeping the family together. They are not about worker power per se, as opposed to some other labor standards about maximum hours for all workers or about occupational health and safety. Specific standards then applied only to certain workers, singled out by gender, occupation, or geographical location. And of course, geographical location stood for workers and subsistence producers in colonialized places, racialized by white Western Europeans, as well as indigenous people facing their dispossession of land and livelihoods. And these treaty-like conventions came into force upon the ratification of nations, while non-binding recommendations served only as guidelines. And the delegates would add provisions to account for national variations, which usually functioned as loopholes for exceptions to these agreements, with so-called dependent territory like colonies, singled out for lesser standards. The impact of any convention depended on whether national laws would conform to its articles. But even when a member state failed to ratify or change its legislation, ILO conventions increasingly served as a basis for campaigns to improve conditions back in the countries and in regions. And this we see particularly recently in the 2011 push for ratification of Convention 189 by domestic workers and their allies, and the most recent convention on gender violence in the world of work, Convention 190. But it also happened with equal pay, equal remuneration earlier in other countries, not only the US, but in Italy, for example, with Liza Belletti has shown. Conventions expressed aspirations, as I've suggested. Now, these images, here, the stock photo about the woman worker, and the focus was women in industry, but there could be different standards from women in the global South. And that the home-based worker, the industrial home worker, this is from more recent, was not included initially. And embedded in all this is what I would call a politics of the body and bodies. So you have a lot of discussion how tropical nations, as well as women's assigned reproductive labor, meant you had to have special standards. And there was a great concern about the making of people through the activities of daily life and socializing the next generation. And that becomes reduced to maternity and family responsibilities throughout the years. Okay, go on. So the home from the beginning is a loophole, is a loophole. At first, with industrial labor as a norm, and the white male Western worker is the ideal worker, labor standards failed to cover women clustered in the home, including family enterprises and farms and offices and services also were not included, which were outside of the home, but they weren't in industry. There were early conventions about plantation labor, and there was a special, for example, recommendation, which was non-binding, for women workers on plantation in terms of their maternity leave. And later on in the 50s, there is a convention on plantation labor, but almost nobody signs that convention. Well, labor feminists saw the sexual division of labor and assumptions about female domesticity stood in the way of equal treatment. Thus, only special provisions could level the playing field. That they gained certain traction with the men in governments and labor federations dominating the ILO speaks to a convergence of interests as much as to the acceptance of the women's position. While some men fought for a male breadwinner ideal so their wives could remain home, others recognized the poor conditions faced by women in the least organized sectors of industry as threatening to workers, to all workers. So a good example is the 1928 minimum wage fixing convention. And it's facially gender neutral, but it's really about conditions such as home-based labor as seen in the early part of the 20th century. Many unionists embraced equal remuneration as well to protect the male rate for the job more than out of an abstract notion of equality. Okay, but this understanding of the home as a place of the family justified exclusion from most labor standards. The concern for caring labors transformed norms established with one group of women in mind into a universal standard. As I said, there's special conventions that targeted places without sovereignty and where unskilled labor lacked organization. A concern with reproductive labor and the stability of so-called native families pervaded discussions of the various so-called native labor conventions, the 1930 Forced Labor Convention, the Contracts of Employment, Indigenous Workers Convention, and the 1947 Social Policy Non-Metropolitan Territories Convention. And what's fascinating, particularly about the Forced Labor Convention, it wasn't a ban on forced labor. It was a convention that set out the rules So forced labor, ironically, could become decent work. That is, you have to provide housing and a minimum wage, and men could only be conscripted from their villages for so many days, and they had to have good food. It wasn't a ban on governments, although it was on private enterprises, taking men, and particularly in Africa, and having them build roads or even carry officials from one place to another. But a concern with reproductive labor and the stability of the family really pervades the debates here. These would limit the removal of men from their villages for too long, lest women become camp followers. Men spend their earnings on drink and prostitution, and village life become disrupted. Women required protection from, as they put it, recruitment serving immoral ends, that is, from sex trafficking. Well, in this period and throughout its history, I have a piece coming out with Magali Rodriguez Garcia in the Journal of Women's History on sex in the ILO. And the ILO was saying, was allergic to talking about sex and sex work, but it ends up, but through the back door, often addressing the issue, which I could talk about later. Well, even for the global north, the home provided a challenge for advancing women's rights. It wasn't only that domestic labor was like family labor. Family responsibilities, or more accurately, the lack of private or public provision to accommodate them, disrupted employment, which served as a corollary to the claim that industrial homework interfered with domesticity, threatening the family through disease and dirt and general unhealthful conditions. Mothers employed elsewhere required aid, creches, canteens, and household appliances. In the early 1950s, the ILO, under Mildred Fairchild, who was from the US, who was from Bryn Mawr, who was a social investigator, under her, she was the head of the women's section within the bureaucracy, and Frida Miller, who under Truman was the director of the US Women's Bureau. These two women together plotted for a convention on domestic work, for a convention on industrial homework, where they got nowhere, but they did manage a revision of the maternity convention for more generous leave. And they did include industrial home workers under, and even domestic workers under the maternity convention, although but it was one of those conventions with a loophole. The governments could decide to ignore that part. And in another talk, I talk about the relationship of those two women and how they mixed their friendship with policy making. And these kinds of networks from women in governments and NGOs and within the bureaucracy of the ILO would prove at crucial moments essential for pushing their interpretation of working women's interests. It's really very unusual to have representatives of working women themselves and their actual voices at the ILO, although occasionally there's an industrial worker from the trade unions. Really, the domestic worker convention that I'll get to at the end of this talk was a breakthrough in which the actual workers being concerned were able to get themselves heard. Yeah. Okay. So by the 1950s, the ILO had promulgated well-received conventions on equal remuneration, which was in 1951, and that was something also that Frida Miller and Mildred Fairchild worked to get. And also later non-discrimination. And what's fascinating about the 1951 equal remuneration, it really is for men and women workers for work of equal value. It's a much more of a comparable worth notion, and it embodies many ways that governments could fulfill this in their laws, and practices, and that represents the kind of compromise. So you can do it by wage boards, you can do it by laws, you can do it through unions, through collective bargaining, for example. Okay. Number 111 was Discrimination, Employment, and Occupation Convention, which was an anti-discrimination convention. And it's fascinating the way how restrictions on women remained acceptable, even within this anti-discrimination framework. And this really was a convention about racial discrimination, much more than, and when sex discrimination, as they call it, was tacked on. And when you read the debates at the ILC, the conference, as well as the committee debates, you see that people's understanding of what would be discrimination against women for their countries varies tremendously. Let's just take one example. The Irish government delegate admitted that his country would be unable to ratify because to curb high unemployment, it barred married women from employment, which should not be termed discrimination. So that was an understanding. In contrast, state socialist nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, claimed that women had both equality, including equal pay for equal work, and protection, such as maternity coverage. This doubleness resembled actually the continuing ILO position that there should be equal treatment except when there was difference. Well, in 1965, the International Labor Conference addressed family responsibilities directly by passing a recommendation targeted to women, its very name. It was women with family. It was employment, women workers with family responsibility. And it was part of an initiative in the early 1960s of women workers in a changing world. This recommendation called for childcare facilities, coordination of transport and school hours with work schedules, and public facilities to lighten household labor. The women delegates generally linked the recommendation to conventions on equal remuneration, the protection of maternity, and non-discrimination as necessary for real equality. Some representatives offered a broader egalitarian claim, such as worker advisor Sigrid Eckendal, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, it's okay, who was a parliament member and former secretary of the Swedish Confederation of Trade Unions. And she argued that responsibility for children and the family is in general the same for man as for woman. The discussion of family responsibilities exemplified the intermingling of women's status with questions of global inequality. So some delegates from Africa, for example, pointed out to the racialized differences within apartheid in South Africa. And these kinds of debates in which women's position became part of these geopolitical struggles in the late 60s and the 70s really became commonplace in terms of South African apartheid and Palestinian dispossession. And that was true no less at the ILO than it was at the UN, as we have heard in Josie's brilliant book on the Mexico City meeting. Contradictions pervaded the gender turn that happened in 1981 when women workers with family responsibilities became workers with family responsibilities. The new standard superseded by substituting worker for woman. But the impulse did come from a recognition that men should participate more in family labor, but also that equality should extend to those doing care along with other forms of work. The new instruments updated the impact of family responsibilities on Social Security and unemployment, and added job relocation for trailing spouses and the adoption of parental leave. While some delegates claimed that discrimination derived from the sex of the worker, others argued that equality would be meaningless if employers could dismiss any worker because they had to attend to child or other immediate family members. Only 19 ratifications, however, occurred by 1991, with countries complaining that they lacked the laws or the machinery to enforce the standard. Several states found implementation would violate their equal treatment provisions because women needed special treatment to compensate for family labor. So you see the persistence of this conundrum of this false dichotomy, I would argue, between equality and difference, when it's really different. It's really equality or non-equality, difference and sameness. When it came to rural women in the global South, and this is, in my book, the heart of my book, it's a dedicated group of feminist development economists recast the reproductive labor of such subsistence and informal workers as essential to economic life. In standard accounting, rural women turned into casualties of underdevelopment and victims of traditional societies. But the staff of the program on rural women, Zubia Ahmed and Martha Lofty, for most of its time, but very early on and very significantly for about 18 months, Lourdes Benaria, and there were others, pushed for changing the definition of the worker, to abolish the separation of the so-called productive work from reproductive work, eventually resulting in the definition of housework as work. They understood how domestic labor directly facilitated capital accumulation. Unrecognized reproductive labor allowed for the low wages of the global supply chain. The program was a prefigurative initiative, funding major studies, and I think we have people here who were involved with the program in some way. And what was really fascinating to me, that major studies on women in development from researchers in the global South in conjunction with local groups. It sought to decolonize knowledge through participatory research. It wasn't always effective. The research often didn't go anywhere, but there were major books and studies that I know when I came of age of understanding any of this in graduate school in the mid-1970s, which I'm aging myself, I turned to these studies on women in development because they were the only place where people were talking about home. The home is a workplace. And one of the inspirations for my own work on industrial homework, of course, was Maria Mies's book on the lace makers. And in doing my research, I found that the ILO was essential to both her funding and that the book really made a major impact and was used as a rationale for the program on rural women to begin pushing for a convention on industrial homework. And it was through through some of these networks of researchers in the global South, which many of the women who founded Dawn, Development Alternatives for Women Now, a South to South organization, were brought together, as in Benaria's Women and Development, the Sexual Division of Labor in Rural Societies, and in other funded work by this program of rural women. And it's it really finally you begin to see how some of this research we've caught up to it. In 2013, the Conference on the International Labor Statisticians redefined work as activities, and I quote, that produces goods and services for household consumption, such as collecting firewood and fuel, fetching water, cooking, cleaning, and also providing care for children, the elderly, and other dependents. Now, having said this, we have to recognize they're still in a laborite mindset, even though they would revalue the informal economy, they're still focusing on work as the highest good. The program recognized that the sexual division of labor, while exposing the ways the male breadwinner, female housewife model had really vitiated the income generating projects directed to women. That women in developing countries had distinct concerns, though, never meant that they should not have equal treatment. And that included home-based and domestic workers. And these groups would demand inclusion in labor standards beginning in the 1980s. The home-based workers, I argue, really led the way, helped by women staffers in the ILO in the program for rural women, and under the leadership of the Self-Employed Women's Association. Here is Renata Zavala. But they won a convention in 1996. Now, this convention, hardly, I think only about 10 countries have ratified, but it was a convention the employers took their stand on. It was almost, the parallel is what's happening with the gig economy today, in which employers are taking their stand in California to try to have Uber drivers, et cetera, in the law to be forever independent contractors. The employers walked out at moments. They all voted against the convention. They tried to stop the procedures to define home-based work and these own account workers, actually, to come under labor standards. So it's a fascinating component of this story, but it set the stage for looking at the home as a workplace deserving of labor standards. Subsequent campaigns for recognizing reproductive as labor as work like any other, despite its unique characteristic, would challenge the very protocols and the organization of the ILO. And we really see that in the domestic workers campaign. So I'm going to end with the number of slides and a discussion of that. Okay, so these are, okay. Okay, let's next. Okay. All right. It's worth looking at a moment at some of the tactics used by domestic workers in gaining Convention 189 in 2011. First is their insistence of domestic workers are workers and should be treated like all other workers. Now, of course, what does it mean to treat any worker who's outside of labor standards like all other workers? What if you have lousy labor standards? It doesn't help you. What if maternity leave or parental leave, like in the United States, is unpaid? So if the US ratified, which it doesn't ratify almost any conventions, I think it's ratified 14 maybe, ratifies the convention, it's meaningless if the standards for all the workers are inadequate. So, but for many countries, their standards are placed. And I would argue that these conventions become organizing tools. Okay. So it's really worth noting the ways in which, with the help of WIGO, Women in Formal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, the International Union of Food, Agricultural, Hotel, Restaurant Workers, and other NGOs, anti-slavery NGOs, and the ILO staff itself, that domestic workers learned how to maneuver and built their organizing capacity and training through this ILO process and became linked as an international movement. Here is Ernestina from Peru, Guillermo from San Francisco. And this is a WIGO organizer, and they're being trained here to talk to the press and to learn a coordinated messaging, which happened in the struggle. These photos are from my colleague and sometimes collaborator, Jennifer Fish. and some from WeGo themselves. And you see the bringing of social movement tactics into the staid ILO. So there was campaigning on the streets of Geneva. The ILO hadn't seen that before. Yes, indigenous workers, when they come to the UN, engage in such. But that was new to the ILO. And the Asian Domestic Workers Network, along with others, paraded in the streets to bring the issue to larger public notice. There was also appeals to the heart. And here we get back to my opening comments about the double edge of affect as a strategy for worker rights. This was from the Transit's work count 2 in Singapore, I believe. She's not just your maid, her name is Lita. She works for her family as well as yours. And so it's this appeal, and employers, some workers, appeal to them. It was a way to say, this person is not one of the family. She deserves dignity, but it's playing with this parallel of she is someone who is supporting her family. And it's fascinating that most of the delegates did at the end vote for 189. And I think in part because many of them felt, well, this is never going to be implemented in their countries. But the Domestic Worker Network became one of the International Domestic Worker Federation through the struggle of the convention process. And here we have some images from its first founding Congress, which was in Uruguay in 2013. And Uruguay was the first country to ratify the ILO convention, but its domestic worker group did not join the International Federation. In part, it was connected to its the Uruguayan Worker Federation, and in many of the Latin American countries were among the most militant among domestic workers and in domestic worker federations, and they saw themselves as part of the labor movements, as opposed to domestic worker groups being connected in the US mostly with NGOs and with ethnic associations. So the political economy and the organizing culture of different countries fed through. In Hong Kong, for example, the multi-ethnic Hong Kong Domestic Workers Association was very much of a union group, except fighting in the contours of the restrictions towards migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong. So all these different international situations of political economies, of organizing cultures, of relationships of women's movements and labor movements to domestic workers, as complicated as they were brought together by the struggle. And you could see the tensions among some of the people in strategies, but the Federation really has grown worldwide and had its second Congress 2 years ago in South Africa. Okay. By the early 21st century, the ILO spoke about unpaid family care and recognized that care work, like household employment, existed as an occupation and thus required protocols and regulation. The care sector suffered from the lack of acceptance that such labor was work in the first place, as I've noted. The association with family labor and domestic service had relegated paid care work to low remuneration, casualization, and invisibility. As the ILO approached its centennial in 2019, domestic work became linked with a re-emphasis on family responsibilities, packaged as care, a component of the Women at Work initiative. The ILO argued that the lack of work-family balance and access to care, what became known as the care deficit, blocked the way to equality in the world of work. And here are some of the images from the centennial and recent studies and initiatives. And so we see home-based labor, and the Homework Convention has reappeared in concerns with the digital labor platforms and how women do this for balancing home and employment, family labor, and income generation, as opposed to men. And the idea of trying to put gender equality at the center of decent work, an ILO phrase, and then looking at care work. And this highlighting of the centrality of reproductive labor appeared as a new departure, but its components really consisted of previous actions brought in from the periphery and refurbished. And the new Director General did seek to recast the problem of care as not only a women's issue, but also men's failure to undertake their share. But when you listen to what the solutions are, they really mostly were care deficits impacting women. So let's have comprehensive national social security systems. Let's have publicly supplied childcare and work site and community centers and well-designed family leave policies. And so care reemerged and remained as part of the problem of the woman worker. Okay. But there was another workplace issue, that women dominate the care sectors, whether education, health, social services, or household work. About a fifth of all employed women worldwide were in such jobs. Call them the world's essential workers. The 2011 Convention on Domestic Work highlighted commodified forms of household and care labor. Displacing care obligations onto another woman, paid little for her services, only shifted the burden, while generating its own care deficits among migrant and low-paid domestic household and other service workers. Doubling investment in the care sector, according to the ILO, promised to generate millions of good jobs. Well, the claim of the current Director General, if we fail to deliver on gender equality, the attainment of decent work for all will be illusionary, framed the centennial efforts. But with gender updating women, the meaning of equality remained fraught. It is in this context that the words of domestic workers and their advocates during debates over Convention 189 underscore the centrality of care work, but as work. As one representative of the International Domestic Worker Network argued in 2010, Vicky Kanoa of Tanzania, we are oil in the wheels. It is our work in households that enables others to go out and be economically active. It is us who take care of your precious children and your sick and elderly. We cook your food to keep you healthy, and we look after your property when you are away. It took workers themselves to push for reevaluating the quotidian labors of daily life, the work that makes all other work possible. But the question remained, even knowing what could be done, would nations do so to benefit all working women and mothers in the home, and thus all of us? Are we willing to organize the labors of care to the slogan, slaves no more, as articulated by Myrtle Witterboy of the International Domestic Workers Federation? Or do we reinforce the, as Sarah Jaffe now puts it, considering work that won't love you back as the highest goal? Or is there something beyond the ILO in gaining a decent life as our right? And this final slide, just to highlight some of the persistent issues: the wage, social insurance, industrial homework, and women's equality, the protection of dependent people, and the way in which, in the process of relieving exploitation and correcting abuse, special treatment could threaten to maintain embodied hierarchies along the intersecting axes of gender, age, race, geography, class, case, and other statuses that mapped onto occupational sectors, because the focus was on transforming the world of employment. And that's all. I'll take questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Yes, so we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Sorry, I didn't realize it was going to take so long. You should have told me to take less.
No, I think that's it was wonderful. Yeah, do we have any questions? Who wants to jump in first? Nicole Barnes.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Professor Boris. That was a fantastic talk.
And where are you coming from, Nicole?
I'm at Duke, but I'm here in my home in Durham. I'm in the history department along with Jolie. Yeah, I do modern China. So I was really interested to hear, thank you for the ILO 101, that it was founded as an anti-Bolshevism move in the post-World War I moment. And then I was struck by the fact that so much of what it did was basically what China was doing under the People's Republic, you know, having public daycares, giving other services for women, attempting to consider women as equal workers to men. Of course, they didn't achieve all of this, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the place of socialism and socialism's goals in the long arc of this movement.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I do deal with the co-war tension in places. And first, the Soviet Union and the US joined the ILO at the same time. I think it's 34 or 35. Before that, neither of them are in the ILO, although US people are there, as in the bureaucracy. The US actually leaves the ILO for part of the 70s and stops funding it because people from the Soviet Union are, like, one of the deputy director generals is from the Soviet Union. And the ILO, like the whole UN system, becomes an arena of struggle between the newly independent states and socialist nations and the market economies led by the US. So that's fascinating. The Soviet Union leaves the ILO when it leaves the League of Nations in 39, when it's kicked out. It doesn't come back into the early 50s. And when it comes back, the US, which by then is controlling the ILO, is saying, well, their employers and their worker delegates aren't real. And the revision of the Forced Labor Convention is all about the forced labor of the Soviet Gulag. And the Soviet Union is using it to accuse the US rightly of its racism. And so it becomes this sort of battle. China enters the ILO, the People's Republic, later. One of the major studies is Elizabeth Call's study about women workers were in China by the Program on Rural Women, and it's considered a model study about women in development, which is absolutely fascinating. So there is a looking at China in the late 70s among many of the socialist, feminist development experts within the ILO. So that's all I can say right now, because I know there's other questions, like Silke has one.
Yeah, we have two questions, one by Silke and one by Jocelyn. So I suggest we collect both of them and then
fine.
Silke, please.
Oh, thanks a lot, Eileen. I was just thinking about something I haven't thought about before when listening to you and this. And it's about, you mentioned Sigrid Ekendahl of Sweden, who was important for this, turning it from a women's issue into a more family issue. I was just recently going through her archives, and what I didn't know, she's the first one to really mention the fathers, also in Swedish Parliament, you know, talking about workers as fathers and their responsibilities. And I was just a bit curious how this was, if this ever came to the ILO discussions, if it mattered or not, and how it was received in case it was discussed.
Yeah, thanks. And let's take the other question and I'll.
Sorry, just unmute myself. First of all, thank you for a wonderful talk. I guess I wanted to hear more about these kind of conjunctural moments when it seems like, I mean, I think we saw one just last year, right? When suddenly unpaid care labor got pushed onto the ILO's radar. I mean, I think there's this, you know, you sketch out a very, you know, compelling history of the way the ILO has been a kind of bulwark against really taking care labor seriously. But there are moments of pushing through and where there seems to be real faith that the ILO, particularly on the part of NGOs and things, the ILO will make a difference. And so I guess I'm wondering, you know, that and I mean, I think the other part of the question is, we have for decades had all the data we need and all of the good feminist research we need to be able to make a case about paid and unpaid care labor and its value. And it's been a pretty, I mean, even now in the middle of a pandemic, when I feel like everybody is seeing how heavily we depend on care laborers, it's seemingly impossible to get either governments or employers or even private households to take this question seriously enough. So I guess I'm wondering where you see, if you see any particular dynamics that lead to those breakthrough moments and who the actors are that actually can make that kind of thing happen.
Yeah, these are both really good questions. To Silke, really it's that moment in 64, 65, in the debate on the family responsibilities that you begin talking about fathers. But it's only a few women from the Nordic countries that really bring that up. And it isn't until the 80s, with the late 70s and 80s, with the talking about parental leave. And that is a way to begin answering Jolie's question, because it depends who's there. All of these measures sometimes take decades. So in a paper that I'm in the process of revising on the road to the Convention 190 on sexual harassment, I mean, people were pushing from the office, feminist lawyers and others, beginning in the mid-1980s, and it took until 2019. And women in the trade union secretariats were pushing in the 80s, beginning in the 80s, for sexual harassment and then gender violence. It takes a very long time. With the care work, that's why I showed images of like Mildred Fairchild and Frida Miller, this inside outside on the level of governments and civil servants within the ILO. That's why I showed the women in the program from Rural Women, which continue to be pushing within the bureaucracy. And it isn't, they had the male head of that, who was an Indian man from Uganda, what's his name, Durham, it's escaping me right this moment. I mean, he was very supportive. There were people supportive along the way, but it moves very slowly. But you have to have people within the bureaucracy getting the attention of the higher ups. And you have to have enough governments joining enough workers to get something passed. And you see these breakthrough moments, I think, early on, even though the women, for very mixed reasons, that the labor feminists have one agenda, the men in the AFL and the other in the French Confederation have other reasons that they come together. You see this in the attempt in the early 50s, if you look at who was pushing then for something on domestic workers, it was the British trade unionists, men and women, for that. But the unpaid care, it is an assumption that we have to support women's reproductive labor so that some women can then reemerge into factories and we can still produce children for the next generation. And that actually within the ILO bureaucracy now, looking at the unpaid care, some of the people working on domestic workers as workers, there was a tension because they thought domestic workers were actually not being looked at, and paid care workers, and the focus was on this unpaid labor, but it's unpaid labor so women can continue being employed. And yeah, the ILO has done some very good reports now, and the International Domestic Workers Federation has been at the forefront in terms of the domestic workers as essential workers. But all of these only are important as groups can bring it back to their country and use them for organizing and struggles. And that happened with equal pay or equal remuneration. And the other moment that I really see it was with the domestic workers and and now with the gender violence. The Homework Convention, in a way, gets there because of grassroots struggle in relationship with these other women, but the governments just don't want to look at it.
Thank you. I think we have maybe time for one more question. Who wants to pose it? Well, I mean, if we, so we're almost at time, so maybe we should wrap up. I don't know. I can't believe that nobody wants to use the chance.
That's what happens when you talk too long, you know? But this was great to be able to share this with you. And, you know, it's a continuing saga. There's so much to cover and so much to explain away.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for.
Now, I want to ask, Gazelle, didn't you do something with the ILO?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, didn't you do something?
Yes, I was. I was actually one of the first to be funded by the rural employment program.
Right, I know that. I know that I was making reference to, but I didn't want to. Yeah.
Yes, so it was after Maria Mises' work, but on carpet weavers. And I see that your book has a cover of a carpet weaver.
It does. It does. I wanted a picture from the domestic workers, and the one I chose, my editor said, "Oh my God, you know, we don't know that this is at the ILO." I mean, it was a multi-rate. I didn't want to have one woman, you know, the problem of representation.
Yes.
And I thought, you know, of all the images, this one's really fascinating because it's emblematic of the way they thought of handicraft as a solution to rural women in the global South when handicraft, you know, wasn't going to earn a living wage.
Exactly. The special projects.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So I hope I've characterized what, you know, if you read that chapter 4 of the book, I hope you agree with what I say about the Rural Women's Program.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a fascinating presentation.
Yeah. No, I saw your name and I said, of course, but I don't, you know, what if I'm wrong? You know, I have such a mind like a sieve.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to do a shout out to her.
Thank you.
This is wonderful. This is a really great talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much again. I want us all to thank Professor Boris again for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Obviously, we all have the book, so you know, the conversation is going to continue in some other venues, I'm sure.
Yeah, put me on the mailing list.